This shows the areas mapped according to the principles and the standards of the International Map of the World by the mid-1920s. It's a fascinating snapshot of the world at that time, and not only because it shows where had been mapped, but also by whom. All these areas in Africa, which at the time are under French colonial rule, Morocco, Algeria, Niger, Chad, are all mapped by the French. Over in Indonesia, Dutch dominions here are mapped by the Dutch. The British Empire, marked on the map here as GB, is also mapping its own imperial territories. Most of India here is mapped by GB, whole parts of East Africa, Southern Africa, and also parts of the Middle East.
Despite the project's best intentions, the millionth maps were being used to further the imperial interests of the West. By the outbreak of World War I, the project's original spirit of international cooperation was fading away.
Far from transcending national differences, the International Map of the World became an extension of them.
Up to 40% of all the developing world's national borders were defined and mapped by the British or the French. Flushed with victory after the First World War, they would use maps to consolidate their power in the Middle East. For centuries, the region between Mesopotamia and Saudi Arabia had been a land without fixed frontiers, as this British Army map from 1907 illustrates.
This is a map without divisions and boundaries. What it shows is the movement of nomadic Arab tribespeople across this whole region. So if you look down here in the bottom left-hand corner, you have the Shamar. This is generally their region. But they're also described as wintering up here. So this is the movement of peoples being shown in a very fluid way without any linear boundaries imposing restrictions upon them.
I belong to the Shammar tribe, and the region of North Arabia was predominantly populated by nomadic tribes with their own territories. But these territories, we cannot describe them as rigid or fixed. They had fluctuating boundaries. These tribal groups would travel all the way up to the north in search of pasture and water, but in the very, very hot months, they would actually retreat either near oases or go even further to a cooler climate. So migration in that part of the world was a common feature of life.
Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, the victorious European powers decreed that a new nation-state was to be carved out of Mesopotamia. It would be called Iraq. The border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia was decided by two men at a conference in 1922. Sir Percy Cox of the British Colonial Office had an uncompromising approach. He wanted to draw a line straight through the desert. For Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, this was an alien concept.
Ibn Saud argued that to impose linear boundaries upon his tribespeople was completely unsuitable because it didn't work for the way in which they moved and they transmigrated across this whole space. What he suggested instead was to keep the boundaries fluid and to keep them open.
This idea of making a map to reflect fluidity and openness was mocked by the British.
This is an eyewitness account written about the conference by one of the translators. At a private meeting at which only Sir Percy Ibn Saud and I were present, he lost all patience over what he called the childish attitude of Ibn Saud in his tribal boundary idea. It was astonishing to see Ibn Saud being reprimanded like a naughty schoolboy by His Majesty's High Commissioner and being told sharply that he, Sir Percy Cox, would himself decide on the type and general line of the frontier. Sir Percy took a red pencil and very carefully drew in on the map of Arabia a boundary line.
So from that moment, this local tribal population, brothers, lineages or clans would find themselves divided. Some of them would be part of Saudi Arabia, others would have become Iraqis, and yet another branch would have become Kuwaitis. And they could not continue as animal herders, and therefore the animal economy collapsed because nomadism was definitely based on the seasonal migration. So economically, yes, the region was affected. But in addition, networks of hospitality, of trust and solidarity, all that had to vanish.
The precision of Enlightenment science had combined with the rule of empire to make a map with the power to destroy an ancient way of life.